Into the 1980s, the American car market had drastically changed. In a post-gas crisis America that was now started to become flooded with compact imports, Ford and its subsidiaries knew that they had to make a monumental shift to appeal to the increasingly larger class of sized-focused buyers. And it was this shift in their corporate strategy that gave us some of their strangest, yet most forgotten cars of all, the Mercury LN7 and the Ford EXP, which were their first two-seaters offered from the Blue Oval since the original Thunderbird came out in 1955. And after a 20-plus year two-seat sports car hiatus, Ford's return to the market with these new cars was complicated to say the least. The story of the EXP and the LN7 all start with the U.S. market Ford Escort. Now, I specifically say the U.S. market cars for a reason. Overseas, the Escort was not only a runaway sales success for Ford, but it had also proven itself as a very capable race car and rally car. Heck, even Cosworth was getting in on the action with the Escorts with their famed RS 1600. Ford never had much success selling its European bestsellers in America, so they thought that for the 1980s, it made sense to try and build a new generation of Escort to sell in the US and abroad from the start. This new Escort was set to replace the Pinto stateside and the Mark II Escort in Europe, both of which were rear-wheel drive economy cars. And this new Escort was released in 1981, and it would make a radical departure from this formula by utilizing a front-wheel drive system rather than the traditional live-axle rear-wheel drive setup. Power would come from a few four-cylinder engine options, but in stock form, these Escorts were nothing special. And to be honest, they didn't look nearly as good as the prior European market models. The new U.S. market Escorts, or these world cars as they called them when they first came out, were very bland, to put it simply. Even still though, they became the best-selling car in America thanks to their aggressive price point and solid practicality. With that being said, for some reason, Ford felt the need to go way outside the box to create a version of it that really didn't make a ton of sense considering how well the car was selling already. Enter the Ford EXP and Mercury LN7. Ford may have felt that the Escort, which they just launched, was a bit too pedestrian for their true enthusiast customers out there, and as such, they launched two radical rebodies of the Escort platform. The standard economy Escort in EXP guise was completely reworked to look more like an MR2 than an EcoBox. It had a pretty aggressive front-end drop-off that was flanked by elevated square headlight pods on both sides. The rear end was a bit more subdued than the front, but that back roofline did feature a pretty aggressive angle to it, and it did give the EXP and LN7 a very sporty silhouette. It was both longer, lower, and more aggressive looking than the regular Escort, and these hit the market in 1982. What the Escort had that the EXP lacked, though, was rear seats. In an effort to give the Escort chassis the sportiest look and feel that they could, Ford and Mercury made the decision to do away with the back seats, which posed a major hurdle for the car, literally, right off the bat. The Escort was a great seller because of its practicality. So for the EXP and LN7s, I don't know why Ford decided to remove the back seats, especially when the last car that they made with only two seats was the first-gen Thunderbird for the general public. And that car they gave back seats to just after a few years in production to make it more practical, and it helped sales. The Mercury LN7 version of the EXP was essentially identical, minus a bigger front grille and a bubble glass on the rear hatch compared to the standard flat glass on the Ford model. Underneath, they were pretty much identical to the base Escort platform, with the full independent rear suspension, independent front suspension, and disc brakes up front with drums in the rear. There was an optional TR suspension package for these cars that added new wheels and tires, new sway bars, and new suspension tuning to make them handle better. But the EXP and LN7 weren't able to quarter their way out of their second largest problem, the Escort's inline four-cylinder engine. When these cars first came out, the 1.6-liter inline-4 that came with the Escort and the EXP LN7s only made about 70 or 80 horsepower depending on the trim selected, hardly a hard-charging motor. And this anemic power delivery was only made worse by the fact that somehow, in designing their sportier two-seat version of the Escort, the EXP was heavier than the Escort technically. No matter if you optioned it with a 4-speed manual, a 5-speed manual, or an automatic, these cars were slower than molasses. The base model cars had a 0 to 60 in a painful 14 seconds, and the quarter mile was in the 19s. The higher output 80 horsepower cars did a little better, but it was still like putting lipstick on a pig. And if that wasn't enough to add insult to injury, with the EXP you got marginally worse performance and 2 less seats than an Escort for a whopping $2,000 more, as the MSRP of the EXP was $7,400 compared to the Escort's $5,400, and the Mercury variant was another $400 more expensive than the EXP. For all this extra money, you essentially got a different body slapped onto an Escort with some different interior bits. But even still though, the dashboard was still identical to that of an Escort. Ford's executives must have been smoking some of the good stuff because they were convinced that they would sell 200,000 of these new EXP and LN7s that first production year in 1982. Spoiler alert, they barely sold half of that. And the second year, sales-wise, was so much worse. Ford realized that they had made a gross miscalculation with this car and scrambled to find a way out of it to stop the bleeding. By 1984, Mercury had fully canceled the LN7, which was selling about as well as ice in Antarctica. Sales were still slumping hard, and to try and quell the performance woes that people had with the EXP, Ford launched a sportier version called the EXP Turbo. Slapping a turbo to the EXP's 4-cylinder did boost overall power to 120 horsepower, which made it significantly more peppy, with 0 to 60 coming in now under 10 seconds, and the quarter mile was in the 17-second mark. Still not fast, but it was a whole lot better than the naturally aspirated cars were. Still though, sales were moving at a snail's pace even with the faster turbo version available. In 1984, they sold just 23,000 cars. Now, part of this conundrum came from a ton of new competition from 1984 onward in that two-seat sports car market, like the Toyota MR2 and the Pontiac Fiero, both of which were better-looking cars that had a true sporty mid-engine layout. Plus, it's also said that the build quality for the EXPs had a reputation for being pretty lackluster, which definitely did not help sales. In a further attempt to stop the bleeding, Ford gave the EXP a facelift in the latter half of the 1985 model year, which saw the front fascia redesigned to make it look more like the Ford Escort rather than a standalone car. Those headlight pods that were so signature to the EXP were gone and were replaced with a more standard front grille. The taillights were also redesigned, and the bubble back glass from the now discontinued Mercury variant was fitted to the EXP. Most people liked the newer redesign, but I personally preferred the quirkiness of the original. Nonetheless, this new fascia also came along with a newly upgraded 1.9-liter inline-4 in place of the 1.6. With a standard 2-barrel carburetor configuration, this motor made about 90 horsepower, but in top trim, it made 116 horsepower with its last fuel-injected variant, which was available with the EXP Sport Coupe submodel, which was essentially a naturally aspirated replacement for the turbo cars. All of these redesigns and changes, though, proved to be null and void, because the EXP was still, after all of this, a slow seller, moving just 30,000 cars in 1986 and then 25,000 in 1987, before Ford finally killed it off to clear up market space for their all-new Ford Probe. They expected to sell 200,000 of these in 1 year, and in the end, they sold 200,000 or so over 7 years. The EXP really was a sales disaster for the company. While the Escort itself was a major sales success, if Ford had just come out with more special Escort variants, they likely would have still captured the hearts of those performance-minded buyers without having to compete with the Fiero and MR2, which partially brought the EXP to its untimely demise. And even though they made 200,000 of these cars, good luck finding one today, because the sands of time have not been kind to them. If you ever owned or had an experience with one of these cars, an EXP or an LN7, then please leave a comment down below. I would love to hear about it. And thank you all for watching another episode of our Rare Cars documentary series.